Shalom. Welcome as we continue our study on this most important chapter in Jewish evangelism, Isaiah chapter 53. This lesson, lesson number 4, will be looking at the rest of the 3 verses as this section of Isaiah, Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, is divided into 5 groups of 3 verses. Now we've looked at 52:13 through 15, the presentation of the servant. We've looked at the first 3 verses of Isaiah 53, the rejection of the servant. We've looked at the next 3 verses of Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6, which is the substitution of the servant. And this lesson will focus on the execution of the servant, Isaiah 53 in verses 7 through 9. And then Isaiah 53:10 through 12, the satisfaction of the servant. Isaiah 53, 7 through 9. Verse 7 says this: He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Clearly you can see the execution here, where he is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. We learn a number of things from this verse. Number 1, the servant would offer no defense during his afflictions. He's compared to a lamb, as a lamb being brought to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, quiet, doesn't defend itself, so he openeth not his mouth. Jesus gave no defense against the accusations in either the Jewish trial or the Roman trial. Matthew 27, Mark 15, before Pilate, and so on. And so he would not defend himself. He was innocent of all charges, but he openeth not his mouth to defend himself. In verse 8, we are told this: He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And again, we learn much from this verse. Here we have the death of the servant. We see that where it says, for he was cut off out of the land of the living. If you're cut off out of the land of the living, you are dead. The death of the servant. And we see that he, the servant, would undergo a judicial trial, taken from oppression and judgment. Those words used in this section refer to the legal process. So ultimately he is condemned to death by legal execution. In other words, his death would not be an accident, not from old age, not from war, but he would die by legal execution, which at the time period of Jesus under the Romans was crucifixion, which was not in existence at the time of the writing of Isaiah. It goes on and tells us that this is the first time in this passage, in Isaiah 53, that it clearly states that the Messiah will die. He was cut off out of the land of the living. Up to this point, we're just told he would suffer. But that suffering would lead to his death. Again, cut off out of the land of the living. And then we are told that he would suffer the legal penalty of the law, death, instead of Isaiah's people, the Jewish people, who deserve it because of transgression. My people. Notice what it says at the end of this verse. He was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. My people consistently speaks of Israel, the Jewish people in the Old Testament. Now, this is one verse, and there are others, that shows that the servant is distinct from Israel. The servant is not Israel. And then in verse 9, we are told this: He made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Here we see the burial of the servant. He made his grave with the wicked, with the rich in his death. He was buried. So he's buried in a rich man's tomb. We also learn from this verse that the servant was totally sinless. He was the perfect Lamb of God, the perfect sacrifice. Externally, he was perfect. It says at the end of this verse, he had done no violence. Externally, he was perfect. Internally, he was perfect. Neither was any deceit in his mouth. He was the perfect, sinless Messiah, servant of God. Now we see this verse in his being buried in a rich man's tomb fulfilled in Matthew 27 when Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. In Isaiah 53, in the last 3 verses of these 5 sections, 10 through 12, we have what you can refer to as the satisfaction of the servant. Verse 10 tells us this: Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him, the servant, to grief. When thou shalt make his soul, the servant, an offering for sin. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. The Lord was responsible for the servant's death. That's very clear from this portion of the Word of God. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He, the Lord, Jehovah, hath put him, the servant, to grief. When thou shalt make his, the servant's soul, an offering for sin. So it's not the Romans, it's not the Jews. Ultimately, it's God the Father, Jehovah, who desired and was pleased that this servant would be put to death as an offering for sin, as the text very clearly tells us. Only God is qualified to provide salvation from sin. Not a church, not an agency, not man, only God. So Messiah's death was not accidental. Actually, we're told in Acts 2:23, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Him is speaking of the Messiah, of Jesus. It also tells us that through the servant, God provided the ultimate and final sacrifice for sin, when thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin. We are told that God was pleased with the servant's death. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. The pleasure of the Lord would prosper in his hand. The servant was an offering for sin. We go on in learning in this verse that the servant would resurrect from the grave. We are told he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days. If you remember in verse 8, the Messiah, the servant, was cut off. In verse 9, he was buried, and now he shall see his seed, and he shall prolong his days, speaking of resurrection coming out of the grave. Now, anti-missionaries, those who would say that this passage does not speak of Jesus as Messiah, one of their arguments is that Jesus had no physical children, therefore did not fulfill Isaiah 53:10, he shall see his seed. They claim that seed always refers to physical offspring, not spiritual children such as disciples. Well, this is just not the case. There are a number of indications that seed is used in a figurative way, in a spiritual way. For example, in Isaiah 57:4, we are told this: "Against whom do you support yourselves? Against whom make ye a wide mouth, and draw out the tongue? Are ye not children of transgression, a seed of falsehood?" Well, obviously, nobody is physically born of a lie. It's a spiritual application here, figurative. In Psalm 22, verse 30, this verse is referring to the Messiah. It's a parallel to what we have in verse 10 of Isaiah 53. It says this: "A seed shall serve him. It shall be counted to the Lord for a generation. A seed shall serve him." That means not a literal physical offspring, but a spiritual generation. And then we have a quote from Rabbi Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 12th century primarily. And he says that it is not used in the sense of natural issues, speaking of seed in Isaiah 53:10, but of disciples or followers in his comment on Isaiah 53:10. In the commentary of Ibn Ezra on Isaiah, it says this: "This," speaking of seed, "refers to that generation which will refer to God, that generation which will return to God, that is, the law of God in the days of Messiah." So not literally a physical offspring, but a generation that will ultimately come to God and follow Messiah and the law of God, Ibn Ezra says. Verse 11, "He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities." Now, we see God again being satisfied with what this servant would go through. And justification is only applied to those who have a personal knowledge of the servant. Look at the verse again. "He, God, shall see of the travail of his," the servant's soul. And God would be satisfied. "By his knowledge of the servant of the Messiah shall my righteous servant," that's the Messiah. Israel's not righteous. Israel's sinful. This servant is righteous, "will justify many." Why? Because he will bear their iniquities. Justification is a legal term. You are set free from the penalty of your sin. The penalty of your breaking God's law has been paid. God's justice is satisfied. The sins of the people are put on the servant's account. They are declared righteous when they come to a knowledge of him. And the servant died for all. In verse 12, we are told this: "Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he had poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors." Now we learn here that the servant will inherit the right to rule. Other scriptures speak of this. Psalm 2, Psalm 110, Revelation 19, 11 through 16. But here we are told, "Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong." Victors divide the spoil. Why will he be able to rule as a victor, as a conqueror? Because he had poured out his soul unto death. Because he died for the transgression of many. He willingly poured out his soul unto death. He was humble enough to be numbered with the transgressors. Now, in the eyes of man's eyes, he died with thieves. because of his mode of death, crucifixion, crucified on a tree. Hanging, we are told, was prescribed for idolaters and blasphemers. Deuteronomy 21. That person who would be hung on a tree would be branded as accursed of God. Crucifixion itself was the most shameful and degrading death penalty to Jew and Gentile alike. It was a public spectacle. You would be naked. You would die very slowly, hung on a tree next to a public road. It was humbling. He humbled himself and was willing to take on this penalty, not that he deserved it, for the transgressors. But in God's eyes, he became sin. Literally, sin offering for us. He bare the sin of many, and he made intercession on behalf of sinners. So in man's eyes, he was dying a criminal death. In God's eyes, he was an offering for the sins of the world. And he made intercession, according to Isaiah 53:12, for the sins of Jew and Gentile alike. Isaiah 53 speaks of Jesus. Attempts to have us speak of Israel, Isaiah, or someone else is built on prejudice and willful blindness. It clearly speaks of Jesus, the Messiah of Israel. Our next lesson, we will continue to look at this amazing chapter, Isaiah 53. Until then, shalom.